When I bought my first one-bedroom apartment in Austin, I thought I understood the business before I signed the final papers. I would make the down payment, finance the rest with a mortgage, find a tenant, collect rent every month, pay the bills, and keep the difference. On paper, it looked simple. I wanted an asset that could eventually produce income without depending entirely on my salary. The apartment cost $240,000. I had enough savings for a 20% down payment, so $48,000 immediately left my account. I treated that as the real cost of entering the rental business. I assumed the difficult part was mostly over. It was not. There were closing costs, insurance, property taxes, and building fees. None of them produced income. Then I walked through the unit again, asking whether a tenant would pay to live there. The answer was yes, but not yet. The walls were worn, some flooring needed attention. The kitchen worked, but the appliances were old enough that I could already imagine a repair bill arriving at the worst possible time. The apartment did not yet look like a competitive rental. I had two choices. I could spend as little as possible, list it quickly, and accept a lower rent. Or I could invest more upfront, make it more attractive, and try to earn a higher monthly payment while reducing the chance that it sat empty. I chose to renovate. Painting and repairs cost about $3,000. Replacing appliances and improving the kitchen added roughly $4,500. Cleaning, lighting, fixtures, and small details added another $1,500. Then I furnished the apartment. A bed, sofa, table, chairs, curtains, and storage pushed the total higher. By the time I was finished, I had spent around $15,000 beyond the down payment. That changed the picture. My $48,000 entry cost was no longer $48,000. I was already more than $60,000 into the property before the first tenant had paid me a single dollar, and the apartment still had monthly expenses. That was the first contradiction I had missed. I thought I was buying income. In reality, I had bought obligations that might later produce income. The mortgage started immediately, so did insurance, property taxes, and building fees. Every day it stayed empty. I was carrying the full cost myself. Before owning the property, an empty apartment sounded like an inconvenience. After buying it, vacancy became a financial loss. If my total monthly costs were around $1,700 and the apartment stayed empty for 2 months, I was paying $3,400 out of pocket just to hold it. That pressure changed how I approached the renovation. At first, I wanted everything perfect. Then I started asking a better question. Would each improvement increase the rent enough to justify its cost? If I spent another $5,000 on the kitchen, but could only charge an extra $50 per month, that improvement would take more than 8 years to recover, even before repairs, taxes, financing, or future vacancies. A nicer apartment was not automatically a better investment. So I stopped decorating it like my own home and started preparing it like a business asset. The furniture had to be durable, not luxurious. The appliances had to be reliable, not impressive. The renovation had to make the apartment competitive with nearby listings. Every dollar needed a reason. Eventually, the work was finished. The walls were clean, the kitchen looked modern, the furniture was in place, and the apartment was ready to list. But financially, it was anything but simple. I had more than $60,000 of my own cash tied up in the deal, a mortgage balance of roughly $192,000, taxes, insurance, building fees, maintenance risk, and an apartment that had still earned $0. That was when I understood what I had really purchased. I had not purchased passive income. I had purchased an asset with recurring expenses and a chance to generate income if I managed it correctly. Now I had to find out what someone was actually willing to pay me every month to live there. When I finally listed the apartment for rent, I felt like I had crossed the expensive part of the process. The renovation was finished, the furniture was in place, and the photos looked good. Now the property could finally start doing what I had bought it to do, produce monthly income. I listed the apartment at $1,950 per month. If I collected $1,950 every month for a full year, the apartment would generate $23,400 in gross rental income. But gross rent was not profit. The first thing I had to understand was vacancy. I had calculated the annual income as if the apartment would be occupied for 12 perfect months every year. Tenants move out. New tenants take time to find. Cleaning and repairs happen between leases. If my apartment stayed vacant for 1 month, I would lose $1,950 of potential rent. 2 empty months would reduce annual rental income from $23,400 to $19,500. The mortgage and other expenses would not disappear during those empty months. Occupancy was one of the biggest drivers of profitability. I started looking at the apartment differently. A tenant paying slightly less but staying longer could sometimes be more valuable than constantly chasing the highest possible rent and replacing tenants yearly. Suppose I raised the rent from $1,950 to $2,050, gaining an extra $100 per month. If the higher price caused the apartment to remain empty for one additional month, I could lose more from vacancy than I gained from the increase. That was my second major lesson. The highest advertised rent was not necessarily the highest earning strategy. What mattered was the rent I actually collected. After several inquiries, I found a tenant. When the first payment arrived, the apartment finally produced revenue. The monthly rent was $1,950. That was the top line. From there, the mortgage, insurance, property taxes, building fees, maintenance, and future repairs still had to be covered. A cleaner interior, newer appliances, a better kitchen, and more reliable fixtures made the unit more competitive with similar rentals nearby. If comparable apartments were renting for $1,800, I could not simply demand $2,300 because I liked my renovation. The market would decide what the property was worth as a rental. But if renovated one-bedroom units nearby consistently rented for more, I had room to raise my asking price when the lease ended. Demand in the neighborhood mattered just as much. A property close to major employers, universities, transportation, restaurants, or neighborhoods where people actively wanted to live could attract more applicants. More demand usually gave me more pricing power and reduced the chance of long vacancies. I had assumed the apartment itself would determine the rent. In reality, part of the rent came from things I did not own at all. I did not own the nearby employers, road, restaurants, or transportation links. But those things affected how many people wanted to live near my property and how much they were willing to pay. If demand increased, I might be able to raise the rent even without changing the apartment. If demand weakened, I might have to lower the price just to keep the unit occupied. So I began thinking about rental income as something dynamic rather than guaranteed. The apartment could earn more if I improved it intelligently, kept it in good condition, responded quickly to problems, and priced it according to the market. But I could not force profitability simply by setting a high number on a listing. By the end of the first lease, I understood that the real goal was not to collect the biggest possible monthly payment. It was to keep the apartment occupied at a sustainable rent, with tenants who paid reliably, while protecting the property's ability to earn again next month. That was when the rental business finally started to make sense to me. Income did not come from owning the apartment. Income came from keeping it useful, competitive, occupied, and worth paying for. When the tenant moved in and rent started arriving every month, I finally understood why rental property looks so attractive from the outside. The apartment was occupied, the payment was predictable, and for a while the numbers seemed calm. Then I looked at what happened after the $1,950 reached my account. That payment was revenue. It was not money I was free to spend. My mortgage came first, then property tax, insurance, building fees, routine maintenance, and smaller expenses I had barely noticed when I first calculated the deal. Some months were quiet, the tenant paid on time, nothing broke, and the apartment seemed almost effortless. I could subtract the obvious bills and call the rest profit. But some of that money needed to stay untouched because eventually something would fail. I learned that lesson during the summer. The air conditioner stopped working. In Austin, that was not a repair I could postpone. I needed someone to inspect it quickly, and the final bill was much larger than the small maintenance costs I had become used to paying. Months of expected profit disappeared. The tenant had not missed rent. The apartment had not been vacant. I had not made a terrible purchase. One machine had simply broken. That was enough to change the numbers. I realized a rental can look profitable month by month, while still being financially fragile over a full year. If I earned a few $100s of positive cash flow during normal months, a repair costing several $1,000s could erase most of that progress. And an air conditioner was only one possibility. A refrigerator could fail, plumbing could leak, a water heater could need replacement, flooring could be damaged. Some repairs were small. Others could arrive without warning and demand cash immediately. That taught me another distinction. Profit and cash flow were not the same thing. The apartment might still be a good long-term investment because rent was helping pay down the mortgage and the property could rise in value. But if I lacked cash when something broke, those future benefits would not pay a contractor today. So I started keeping a reserve specifically for the apartment. I stopped treating every dollar left after the monthly bills as personal income. A portion stayed in the property account for repairs, vacancies, and surprises. That made my monthly profit look smaller. It also made the investments safer. The biggest mistake I could make was withdrawing every good month and assuming the next month would look the same. Then I faced another risk. Water. A serious leak can become expensive quickly because the cost is not always limited to fixing one pipe. Damage can spread to walls, flooring, cabinets, or neighboring units. Insurance may cover some events depending on the policy, but deductibles, exclusions, and uncovered costs still matter. That meant insurance required more attention than simply paying the premium. I needed to know what was covered, what was not, and how much cash I could still owe after a claim. The same was true of building fees. They looked predictable until I considered that the building could require major shared work. Depending on the property and association rules, owners can face extra assessments for large projects. Suddenly, my rental business had two categories of costs. The first was visible and predictable: mortgage, taxes, insurance, and regular fees. The second was irregular: repairs, replacements, vacancy, damage, and unexpected bills. The first category determined whether the apartment looked profitable on a spreadsheet. The second determined whether that profit survived reality. That changed the way I measured success. I no longer asked whether the rent covered this month's bills. I asked whether it could cover the average cost of owning the apartment across good months and bad ones, because one quiet month could make me feel profitable. One broken air conditioner could prove I was not. When I started comparing my apartment with other rental properties, I noticed something that seemed almost unfair. Two owners could buy apartments for similar prices, charge similar rent, and still end up with completely different results. One apartment could stay occupied almost all year. Another could sit empty for months. The difference was often location. My apartment was in Austin, close to employers, restaurants, transportation, and neighborhoods where people were already looking for places to live. A good location did not guarantee profit, but it gave me more chances to earn it. When a tenant moved out, I needed the next tenant quickly. Every week of vacancy reduced my annual income, while the mortgage, insurance, taxes, and building fees continued. If the apartment rented for $1,950 per month, one empty month meant $1,950 in lost revenue. 3 empty months meant $5,850 gone. That was when I realized that vacancy was not simply a temporary pause. It was one of the largest costs in the business. People rarely choose an apartment because of the unit alone. They choose access to work, school, transportation, shops, entertainment, safety, and convenience. The apartment is part of a larger package. That meant a modest apartment in a strong rental area could outperform a beautiful apartment in the wrong place. I imagined buying another property in a cheaper city because the purchase price looked attractive. Suppose I found a one-bedroom apartment for $170,000 instead of $240,000. At first, that sounded better. I would need less money up front, and the mortgage could be smaller. But then I asked the question I had learned to ask in Austin: who would actually rent it? If the area had weak employment, limited transportation, few students, declining population, or too many competing rentals, the lower purchase price could become a trap. A cheap apartment that remained empty was not cheap. It was an expense with walls. If that property rented for $1,500 but remained vacant for 4 months, I would collect only $12,000 in rent during the year instead of $18,000. The mortgage would still need to be paid 12 times. So would taxes, insurance, and other fixed costs. Suddenly, the supposedly cheaper investment could require more money from my salary than the more expensive apartment in Austin. The purchase price mattered, but the cheapest property was not automatically the best deal. What mattered was the relationship between price, rent, expenses, and demand. I also learned that strong demand gave me options. If several qualified tenants were interested, I did not have to accept the first applicant. I could evaluate whether the tenant could realistically afford the rent and whether the application met my standards. If demand was weak, the pressure worked in the opposite direction. Every empty day cost money, and that pressure could tempt me to lower the rent too aggressively or accept a tenant I would normally avoid. So location affected more than rent. It affected vacancy, tenant selection, pricing power. There was also competition. If 10 similar apartments were available nearby, tenants had choices. I might need better pricing, better condition, faster communication, or more attractive terms just to compete. If supply was limited and demand remained strong, keeping the property occupied became easier. By this point, I no longer judged an apartment by how impressive it looked during a viewing. I wanted to know who lived nearby, where they worked, why they rented, what competing units cost, and how quickly listings disappeared. I had originally thought the apartment was the investment. Now I understood that I had invested in a location, a stream of future tenants, and the local economy surrounding the building. The walls gave me something to rent. The location determined how often someone wanted to rent them. Demand became the invisible engine behind every month of rental income I received. By the time I had owned the apartment for a while, I had stopped asking whether rental property was a good investment in general. The better question was whether this apartment could produce enough income to justify the money and risk I had taken on. At first, I focused almost entirely on rent. If I collected $1,950 every month, that sounded like success. But after learning about vacancies, repairs, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, I realized rent only mattered in relation to what it had to cover. So I rebuilt the numbers. The apartment generated $23,400 in gross rent if it stayed occupied for all 12 months. From that amount, I had to subtract the mortgage, taxes, insurance, building fees, maintenance, and repair reserves. If the apartment stayed occupied and the year was calm, I could finish with positive cash flow. But cash flow was not the entire return. Every mortgage payment also reduced part of the loan balance, gradually increasing my ownership. Then there was appreciation. If the apartment increased in value, that could add another source of wealth. But I learned not to depend on it. Property prices can rise, stay flat, or fall. I could control my purchase price, rent, condition, and expenses. I could not control the market. So I wanted the deal to work without assuming appreciation would rescue it. If the property only looked profitable because I expected its price to rise rapidly, I was not buying a strong rental business. I was making a bet on the market. The economics became more attractive when the apartment could comfortably pay for itself from rent. I wanted enough income to cover costs, survive repairs, and leave enough cash flow that one bad month would not destroy the year. Vacancy mattered just as much. An apartment that looked excellent when occupied could become mediocre after several empty months. That meant tenant retention became part of profitability. Keeping a reliable tenant, maintaining the unit, and pricing rent realistically could create more value than always pushing for the highest rent. I had started this journey thinking that owning property was the difficult part. Now I understood that buying was only the beginning. The purchase price determined how much debt I carried. The location influenced demand. The renovation affected what tenants were willing to pay. Operating costs determined how much rent I kept. Tenant quality affected payment reliability and potential damage. Property management connected everything. A mistake in any one area could weaken the entire investment. That was the final expectation reversal for me. A rental apartment did not become profitable just because someone else was paying my mortgage. The tenant was paying rent. I was still running a business. If the rent was too low, costs were too high, vacancies were too long, or repairs were constant, I could own an appreciating asset and still struggle with cash every month. But if I bought carefully, controlled expenses, kept reserves, chose strong rental demand, and managed well, the numbers could improve. Over time, the mortgage balance could fall, while rents might rise with the market. That combination was where the investment started becoming powerful. Not instantly, not automatically, and definitely not passively. I had entered the rental business believing the apartment itself would make me money. What I eventually learned was that the apartment was only the vehicle. The real return came from the decisions surrounding it, the price I paid, the debt I accepted, the tenant I chose, the costs I controlled, the vacancies I avoided, and the patience to keep the property financially healthy long enough for those advantages to compound. That was when renting out the apartment became more than a monthly rent check. It became a system I understood. And once I understood the system, I knew what would determine whether the apartment built my wealth or slowly drained it. If this video helped you understand rental property a little better, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the other videos for more stories about how money and business really work.